All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second Monday version of the Carvel community meeting. We have some exciting updates to discuss today. Just a reminder, in this meeting, please adhere to the code of conduct, which is listed at the top of the agenda page. I'm going to add this to the chat so that everyone has it on hand. And I'm going to kick it over to Erin Hurley to go over all the agenda items and share a screen so we see what's on the agenda.
All right. Can y'all see my screen?
Yep.
Cool. So yeah, we'll just do some very brief updates, run through this week's plans, and then cover any discussion topics today. So please feel free to add a discussion topic if there's anything that you would like to discuss. So for updates, we'll keep it a bit more brief this week since we did a deeper dive last week. But the image package include non-distributable layers track has wrapped up. And we released a version of image package that provides functionality last week. We do have one remaining item before we completely close this effort out, which is to consume GGCR's next release, assuming that that has our upstream contributions that we provided there. Next up, YTT schemas, that's still in progress. We'll take a look at the ZenHub board to see where that's at. And then the kind of next areas of work that we have, which we'll cover today. We have image package enhancements. So these are just some of the issues that have been selected as the ones that we want to prioritize next. We have some image package performance related investigations that we're planning to do. Image package recursive bundles is, there's currently a proposal out there and we're planning to write stories later this week. YTT overlay error message improvements. We'll discuss those stories today. And then there are some YTT enhancements that we may get to today, but these are things that are at least in our backlog for the future. I guess other updates, just to mention, we did have a few releases last week. I didn't list them here, but I know that I think there's a vendor release, a K-build release. Shout out to Ben Moss for contributing the ability to build with Co. The image package release, which I mentioned, I think that was all of them from last week, but please, anyone else chime in if I'm missing one. Cool. We'll move to the ZenHub board then. So let's see, for schemas, I don't think there's anything new to discuss here. We've pointed the stories. We can see that the overlay default operation on array items is append story is in flight. After that, we have some documentation work to do, as well as some usability testing. The include non-distributable layers work, as I mentioned, that's pretty much wrapped up. We just need to consume upstream changes once they're available. I think what we'll do here is, so we can talk about the, I guess, I'll just pop these up real quick. We, as a team, have already discussed and pointed these, but these are in our backlog now. So for image package, we have this issue, which is support and keychain for registry auth. Mainly just sharing it here. I don't think we need to discuss further. And then after that story is the image package tagless digests as false by default instead of true. Again, context is in the issues, but as a team, we've discussed these before. So continuing to scroll down the prioritized backlog to the next unpointed story, this would be the improve overlay error messages track of work. So we have two stories here in our backlog. And Garrett, would you like to walk through these?
Yeah, sure, Aaron. So this is the first story on the actual implementation steps of improving our overlay error messages. We did our first round of user testing and we successfully identified an improvement to the error messages that we could make right now. And the big detail of that is we could improve these error messages further, but we wanted to have an iterative approach to this because we never really know when we're going to find the perfect error message. So since we'd identified something that makes the error messages easier to read and easier to identify where the problem is, we want to make that change. However, during the user testing, we only did about 3 different scenarios. So there's a lot of different overlay scenarios that were not covered during this investigation. And that is the purpose of this story, is to identify more of the overlay scenarios where we could fail and how can we apply our new template in the way that we want to convey the information of the failure to these new scenarios. So the purpose, the acceptance criteria of this story is to essentially create and refine the acceptance criteria of the next story. So if you click on that HackMD document list linked, this is going to be all the information from the user testing. Oh no, so this is actually the error. Yeah, can you go back to the ZenHub board? And then in the notes, the first link. So this is the information of the user testing and everything that went on. And then down at the bottom are the results. That should have the template, or that should have some information about why we accepted what we did and what the next steps are. And then in that other HackMD document is where I intend the work for this story to go, is essentially we have mapped out some of the cases that were already covered by our error message, but we need to make sure that there are cases that we've thought of and that we've planned on how we plan on presenting that error message. So are there some questions?
Do folks understand what we're asking for the story? If so, maybe we can do a round of pointing to see what folks are thinking.
Is this story to create stories, or is this story to implement the error messages?
The story is to create the document that will help guide the implementation. So it's kind of like a guiding material for the next story, which is the implementation step.
So the deliverable here is another story, another issue that will be implemented.
The deliverable will be the HackMD document, which will be used in the next story. So it's not like you have to write out the next story. All you have to do is more like a chore of investigating the current overlay error messages and then making sure we have a way to apply the template to that error case.
So Garrett, if I understand correctly, earlier the first HackMD document that Aaron pulled up and embedded in the acceptance criteria, this is the HackMD document that you would like to add more scenarios, correct?
Yes. So currently we have like the type mismatch and the not enough documents. And those are there because those were examples that we used during the interview testing, the user testing.
Yeah, so then the goal is here to identify as many error scenarios as possible where we can apply, where we could possibly apply in the next story, the template error template message that we have identified from the first round of user interviews, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Folks have any other questions?
So this is a chore, right? It's not really a pointable feature.
Depends how now with our new world of, I guess, ZenHub issues, we could choose to just point everything. Like there isn't necessarily a chore designation. We could label it as a chore if that helps clarify things. I don't know. What do folks think here?
Feels like more like a time boxed thing more than anything.
Okay. What's an appropriate time box?
Is that something you guys would want to vote on?
I feel like this is a way for us to sort of reconcile if we have a different idea. If we're getting different pictures in our heads of what's involved, we'd find out right now if we sort of all sort of, played a round of poker game, the planning poker, throwing points. Just to get a sense for what we're thinking is involved and have that conversation.
Sounds good. Let's do a round of pointing and see where folks are at. All right, 3, 2, 1, shoot. We got 0 to 2. I think we got, let's see, 3 2s, 2 1s, and a 0.
Maybe I'll start. Given that I don't see technical complexity here, eventually I might go to 1, 2 because of like uncertainty of discoverability, and I would not spend more than a day around this. Especially because it feels like that the what we try to achieve here is just a document that will be spun into stories, right? So I don't think we should use a lot more time on that.
See, maybe here from a 2.
Yeah, I threw a 2 because I think that the complexity involved is working through. I think there's a bunch of stuff that we can unpack with what we know. So I feel like what's useful to defer is what you need to learn, and what's useful to consider now is what you can know. And it's just that there's just a number of things to kind of lay out, and that there's some design effort here. I know we don't do necessarily a lot of thinking about UX per se, but that's involved in this, and call it technical work of a different flavor. But that's what I was thinking of when I threw it too.
Anyone else want to share their thoughts on how they pointed?
One of the reasons that I threw 2 was because the scope isn't clearly defined. Like, I'm not exactly sure when I would be done with the error message improvements. So it seems sort of open-ended, like you're done when you think you're done.
That's a great call out. Is that something we could provide more clarity to? So like, I guess time boxing is one way where you can constrain your efforts, but is there a better definition of done that we can give ourselves?
I think one thing to note is there's a difference between when are we done with improving overlay error message versus when are we done identifying enough error scenarios here. maybe distinguish into the two might help. Like, by no means, I don't think we're gonna. I think Garrett pointed out earlier that improving overlay error message is gonna be an ongoing task, which I don't think is gonna be done with any of the stories here. But I think we could scope or define scope for like what's enough error scenarios that we identified as part of it.
So what does enough look like?
It's a really hard question. I think it would be helpful if someone who picks up this story looks into the code to try to define that. This story doesn't really call that out, that like you might want to spend time in the code, but that might be helpful to identify these different scenarios that show up, because in a YTT overlay, you can feed it a function. And we know that's a very large space of the different ways that you can match and replace and all that in a function. And how are we going to deal with an error scenario like that, where the inputs could be any combination of a set of functions that you're matching with?
Not sure if I captured this correctly, but yeah, go ahead.
I'm not exactly sure what the research has surfaced so far, but I assume it's something like we've identified 2 different places in the code that we want to improve the error message for, like some number of places that we want to improve messages. I wonder if it makes sense to make the story like identify X number of error messages that we can improve. Like, I'm curious what you think, Garrett, because I know that you had some part in like identifying the error message improvements in the past. So if it is like that, would it make sense to make it like a specific number of improvements?
I think that would make sense if someone had done the legwork to kind of figure out a number that would work. That was something when writing this story that I told myself was out of scope of just writing the story, is trying to collect that information. I think we could come up with a number. I don't know how like timely that would be. The idea of the template was that we would want all our overlay messages to change, error messages to change. And how we get the information or how we present the information in each error might be slightly different based on the information that's available. And so like a kind of cop-out answer is all of the errors, but if that seems infeasible, absolutely, I think we should give up an easier target to hit.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we need to do research in order to even know that. Okay.
So should this be a one-day story to do that research, to understand what is the scope of the work that this story is trying to achieve? And from there, we can create stories that will be pointed and say, like, I want to change the message in this particular scenario and go from there. Like, to be fair, I don't feel comfortable of putting a number 10 of number of errors that we want to search for. I think that this should be something that should be happening from time to time, and we should dedicate like a day or something every other month to try to find more use cases to bring them up. Or if we have people that are using our tool and are banging against a particular scenario where the error message doesn't make sense, just start from there and start improving the messages from there.
Okay, what if we were to throw like an initial time box of a day on this, and then the pair or individual can check in with the team to see if more information is needed? Does that sound like a reasonable, I don't know, reasonable guidance for this?
I like that idea because then I think after that day we'll have a better idea of the scope of the story and like where to go from there. So that would make me feel a little bit better about like the scope.
Okay. Let's try pointing once more with all these considerations then and see where folks are landing. So 3, 2, 1, shoot. Mostly 1s and a 2. I'll take 1 as majority. Cool. Anything else people want to chat about with this, or are we okay to move on?
I just wanted to mention, I know Joelle said that like we can identify a specific scenario and then like implement that scenario. And in a way, that first round HackMD document that's supposed to be the acceptance criteria is supposed to be that for you, the one on the left. So like we would have the use cases, which are the inputs below, and saying like, this is the case that got us to this error, and this is what we want the new error to look like. So in a way, we kind of, in a perfect world, want that to have like, this is the error we want to fix, and this is how we want to fix it. But we just haven't identified all those errors yet.
Do I understand correctly that like the deliverable, the acceptance criteria for this story is that we will update that document with the new error cases? I'll update this story to say that in the acceptance criteria since I have editing permissions for that.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks.
Is there any particular reason why we want to do this in a document instead of just creating the issues with the acceptance criteria? It feels like we're doing two different jobs when we could just be creating the issues, because they will become issues. So
yeah, I think this doc is like an artifact for the engineers to ease in their implementation. If you want to, I think it would be okay to capture the context in the next story. So there is this following story, which is implement the changes that were identified in the story we just discussed. So I think that's a good consideration, is we could just update this. Does that make sense?
Sounds good.
And do folks want to discuss this story now, or do we want to wait until, I guess, the first story is worked on before diving into, I guess, trying to estimate how we would implement it?
if this is a particular scenario, I don't mind discussing it right now. If this is a catch-all, first of all, I don't really like catch-all stories. I'd prefer to have a story per scenario. But yeah, that's, I don't know. What do y'all think?
+1 on that.
I don't think there would be much to talk about either.
Okay, we'll keep this here as a placeholder, assuming that, I guess, more concrete stories will come in with more guidance on how we plan to implement it. Cool. And then we have, let's see, next YTT story. So this is certainly down the backlog a little bit, but since we have some time, we can discuss it. So this one, automatically detect when a YAML file is a template or plain YAML, obviating the infamous ignore unknown comments flag. John, I see that you wrote this. I didn't ask if you were ready to prepared to speak to this today, but are you able to speak to it?
Yeah. So the essential difficulty, someone is sending in YAML, usually it's from like a third party, and they just want to have it included in their output. It's not a template, but by default, YTT is going to assume it's a template and process it as if it were. And one way, and then it'll complain if there is a comment in the YAML document because it's ambiguous in a template. If you provide a comment, is this an actual comment or is this you meant to include one of the derivatives or an annotation? And so we want to err out if in a template we're unsure whether or not this piece of meta is ambiguous. So it's like, is this code or is it a comment? So after much talking about this, and this particular issue has been talked about for well over a year, I believe, we came to the desire to, and by the way, like that there is no short version of that flag by design. It's something that, because it's turning off did include that whole ignore unknown comments. And we actually see that in some documentation in products that have been using YTT. So the fix we came upon is for YTT itself to recognize when a particular file is a template and when it's just plain YAML. And when it's just plain YAML, there's no need for us to try and catch any coding errors because it's not a template. And so that's the essence of the story, is to detect when a particular YAML document is a template and when it's not. And when it's a template, parse it like we normally do. And when it's not, treat it as plain YAML.
Folks have any questions?
Do we already have a way of saying that this is a YAML file, plain YAML
Yes.
file for us not to process? Does that exist?
Yep, there's a file mark for it. So think of this as automatically applying a file mark, if you will, or, just as a shorthand, not necessarily as an implementation requirement, but yeah.
And the only requirement is that it doesn't contain pound ats?
I guess so. I think so. And I think I'd leave that to the implementer to make sure that we're saying that right. But to refine what is the definition of what makes a YAML file a template if we're attempting to detect it.
That -- ignore unknown comments that's now deprecated, could you assign it a Boolean value? Could you say like false, don't ignore unknown comments, or is it just always just a flag's presence is always true?
It's a Boolean today.
So you could assign it to false. You could say, okay, and that just goes away. So if someone had -- ignore unknown comments set to false, meaning they don't want to ignore unknown comments, if this flag goes away, they have no other way to get back that kind of requirement.
Say that last part again. Sorry, Dennis.
If this eventually this flag's going to be deprecated, as in I envision this flag just not existing after some version. And suppose they did not want to ignore unknown comments. So they set it to false. Once that new version comes in that doesn't support this flag, is there any way to support that old way of using the flag, setting it to false in the new world? I haven't thought too much through, but
yeah,
yeah.
So the intent was no.
Mm.
That if you want checking on a particular file, then you would use a file mark to say this is a template.
Okay, got it. So you'd give it like a non-YAML file mark it as a YAML template, and then it would go back to operating as if you set false to this flag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
Okay.
you meant to say there was a YAML document that's not a template. You can mark it as if it were a template.
Yeah.
And get that check. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. And it's not part of this story, but there'll be a story in the future where we can just delete this flag and delete it from our code base.
Yes, that'll be some significant time in the future to allow for it to just go away. Yeah.
What happens if you have a template file and you want to add a comment on it? Because if we're losing this,
that's still
flag
doable with YTT's pound exclamation mark.
Okay, so you have to be using template paraphernalia in the end. Okay.
Oh, how about around the pointing? See where folks are thinking about complexity here. All right, 3, 2, 1, shoot. We got a couple ones, few twos. Either side want to speak to their case? How about we start with a 1?
Sure, I threw 1. I think the only complexity I see here is determining whether there are any template markers in a file. And that doesn't feel too far off from prior art.
So any thoughts from a 2?
One of the reasons I pointed as a 2 is for a similar reason. Like this will essentially change the code from being an explicit explicit way of knowing whether a file has like YTT comments in it to an implicit detection of that. And so I wasn't sure if we'll need to like change the way or the order that we process our templates in, like processing the templates before stripping the comments. And sort of like the unknown for me is like, are we going to need to change the order that we do things in order to get this to work?
That just prompted me to question, should we start adding another, I guess I'm going to call it a debug flag, whereby we output what type of file we are interpreting each file that is given as input? Sort of like a reverse file mark where tell me, here's all the files I provided it. How is YTT using those?
Yeah, we do have an inspect files. I'm not sure, or files inspect. I'm not sure. I don't think it shows type. That sounds like an interesting enhancement. In terms of my pointing, I +1 with what Carrie said, and I think that there's enough of a change in some of the interaction. I think the documentation and maybe some examples would need to take a sweep through. I don't think it's completely trivial documentation task.
All right, let's try pointing once more to see where see if anyone has changed their minds. So 3, 2, 1, shoot. All 2s. Okay, cool. All right, so that, after pointing that story, we should have a significant runway for not just this week, but likely next week. Though we might have the recursive relocation stories to discuss then. I think the only other thing to mention, I guess from a Carvel-wide perspective, is like we do have another Epic here, Package Manager API MVP. We took a first pass at drafting these stories. So this is work being done on Cap Controller. Not planning to go into these right now, but mainly just wanted to surface awareness that this is upcoming work. But I believe we have covered enough information for today. We only have one discussion topic, which we can kick off.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everyone that we are hosting a CNCF webinar tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. Just follow the link there to register to attend. Other than that, thank you everyone for joining today's community meeting. This was recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube playlist. If you're watching the recording from home later on, we hope that you do join us live for the next meeting. We host these every Monday, 11:30 a.m. Pacific time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. Please join the Google group, which is also listed in the agenda notes at the top, and you'll receive invites to the meeting. But with that, everyone, thank you and enjoy the rest of your week.
Are we going to have meeting next week?
Oh, good point. We will not be meeting next week. It is a holiday here in the United States, so we are canceling next week's meeting. So we will see you the following Monday, and I don't have my calendar in front of me on the exact date. That will be Monday, February 22nd will be our next meeting. Great call out. Thank you. So we'll see you then. Cool.
All right. Thank you.